Installing the IBM Flex System Enterprise chassis in the rack. You will need at least 10U of available space to install the IBM Flex System Enterprise chassis. If you have an adjustable rack, set the distance between the front and rear EIA flanges to 719 millimeters, 28.3 inches, outside to outside of the rack. Make sure there is sufficient room in the front of the EIA flange to provide a minimum bezel clearance of 50 millimeters. Align the rack template with the holes on the rack. For the EIA flanges with square holes, install M5 cage nuts from the rack installation kit in the holes that are indicated on the template. Note, if the EIA flange has round holes, install the M5 clip nuts from the rack installation kit. Retract both chassis rails if they are not already retracted. Position the left chassis rail in the selected location on the rear of the rack. Align the post on the chassis rail with the corresponding holes on the rear of the rack rail. Insert the post on the rear of the chassis rail through the holes on the rear rack rail until the hooks snap into place. Pull the chassis rail forward and insert the posts on the front of the chassis rail into the holes on the front rack rail until it snaps into place. Repeat the same step to install the other rail. Note, make sure that the bottom edge of the chassis rail is aligned with the bottom U that you want the chassis to rest on. If you misalign the chassis rail, press the locking hook's release or squeeze the locking hooks on the chassis rail, slide the posts out of the hole and try again. Make sure that the chassis rail posts protrude through the holes on the front rack rail. Install an M5 hex head screw in each end of the rail. Use the lower threaded hole on the front and the upper threaded hole on the rear. Repeat the same step for the other rail. Attach the chassis handles. Align the slots on the handle with the posts on the side of the chassis and slide the handle up until it locks into place. Lift the chassis up. Note, 3 people are required to lift an empty chassis on the rails. Place the rear of the chassis onto the chassis rails and slide the chassis into the rack until the rear chassis handles are near the front rack rails. While you support the chassis, remove each rear handle by pressing inward on the spring latches on the handle and sliding the handle down. Slide the chassis farther into the rack until the front chassis handles are near the front rack rails and remove the front handles. Then slide the chassis all the way into the rack. Remove the plastic label plates from both sides of the chassis. Insert 8 M5 Phillips screws into the front of the chassis to secure it in the rack. Reinstall the plastic plate on both sides of the chassis.